Hello everyone, I'm Carly, but for today's episode, you can call me Adam Savage because we are mythbusting. And welcome to Read Receipts. And welcome to our Summer of Love feature event, the Come As You Are miniseries, where we dive deep into topics from the book with the same name by Emily Nagoski. While you can certainly learn a lot about your sexuality in this series, I highly recommend looking into her book, reading it, listening, however you want to do it. If you want a deeper understanding of anything that we talk about in this series, I recommend going back to the text because Emily has done a lot of work putting all this stuff together and she truly knows best. So if you need a further understanding, check her out. Thank you so much, Emily, for your contributions to society. You are truly mother. Also, if you're not watching this on YouTube, I do want to give a shout out to the people who can't see me, but I am wearing a t-shirt today that says, I shaved my balls for this. Just felt appropriate for the occasion. Actually, it probably would have been more appropriate for episode 1, but better late than never. In case you missed it, there are 3 other episodes in this series that are already out, so if you haven't checked those out, I recommend you do so. But as for today's episode, we are myth-busting. Technically, more specifically in this episode, we're going to be talking about arousal and desire, but it just so happens there are a lot of misconceptions around these things, so we're going to get to the bottom of it. In this episode, we're really going to be talking about the feelings that one experiences during sex. There's the more I like that response, known as arousal, and there is the I want that response that is known as desire. And again, I mentioned that there are misconceptions around this stuff, and there are, but it's also not very surprising that there are so many misconceptions, not just because obviously our sex education in this country pretty much sucks, no matter which state you grew up in, but also these are really deeper understanding topics that are not really as well known. So it makes sense that this is a lot more of stuff that you might have an idea of just based on your own feelings, maybe some hearsay, not so much what you might know from a sex therapist like Emily. So we're really going to get a good mix of scientific research and also therapeutic understanding in this episode to get a greater understanding of these topics. Typically, when we think about arousal, something that we, I think, take for granted is that we assume that our brains are in concordance with our bodies as far as how they are responding to something. If you're a man and you see something that arouses you, obviously the penis is going to get hard. No, I'm not reacting. And if you're a woman, your vagina is going to get wet, right? That's what we would all assume. Wrong. And you might even thought to yourself, well, yeah, maybe that's what you would expect, but that doesn't really happen for me. And that's because for a lot of women, that is actually not the case. And really this applies to men too. It's just that there is a higher likelihood that this is the case for men, but there is such a thing as sexual arousal non-concordance, which basically means that your genitals' response to something is not necessarily the same as your mind's response to something. So there was actually a study done to record this, to see how often the body's response to a stimulus matched up with the actual response in that person's mind. And for men, it matched up about 50% of the time, which in terms of science is a pretty strong, significant relationship, which is why there is a little bit more of a likelihood that for men, your genitals response and your mind's response is going to match up and that you will experience concordance in that way, but it's not a given. Now, for women, just guess how often the genital response was the same as the mental response. 10% of the time. That is 1/10, 10%, 1 out of 10 times that the body was responding the same way that the mind was responding. Basically all that to say, your genitals had 9 out of 10 times a completely different response to how you thought. So the more common response that I think women typically think of is that despite being aroused or what they feel like is aroused, their body isn't really responding to that exact way. And that certainly happens, but that is not the only option that you could have. You could also have the problem where your body is responding as though you are turned on or you are aroused, but your mind is like, I am not interested in this. I do not care. And that is because really the genitals are only good for reacting to something in knowing that it's sex related. Only really the person themselves can say whether or not they like or dislike something, but the body is going to see something and it's going to say, well, I know that's sex related, so I am going to respond the way that I am supposed to a sex related thing, and then X, Y, and Z might happen. And in addition to this, women's genital arousal varies from person to person the same way that our brakes and accelerators differ from person to person. For instance, if you're someone that has a more lower sensitivity brake but a higher sensitivity accelerator, then you're more likely to experience more blood flow, and therefore you're more likely to experience a genital reaction, whether or not you are actually aroused. And then if you are a person with more high sensitivity brakes and a lower sensitivity accelerator, it will lead to less blood flow, and it'll make it so you're less likely to experience a genital reaction despite being aroused. And if you're still not 100% sure on if you are believing what I'm putting down, non-concordance doesn't just exist with regards to genital response. This can also be applied to any emotion. For instance, they did a study where they recorded times when a person said they experienced goosebumps versus their body actually experienced goosebumps. And there were plenty of people experiencing non-concordance there, right? Just picture a song in your head that you know that when it gets to a certain part and it hits just right and it's getting at your emotions and you feel that shiver down your spine, you know for a fact that you're feeling goosebumps, you are feeling the experience of chills down your back or whatever. But then for a lot of people, if you were to actually look at their skin, no reaction. So this can really happen with any emotion. This is the example that we're working with, again, because of the nature of what we're here to talk about. But you can experience non-concordance in a lot of different ways. Surprisingly, this information has been out there for a while. I believe that Emily said that the studies that I was referring to happened in the 90s. So this is stuff that's been out there for 30-ish years. And yet this is not what we culturally accept. And the reason why that is the case is, can you guess? The patriarchy. Basically because men tend to more often have concordant experiences, it is generally understood that genital arousal equals actual arousal. But it's really important that we don't fall for this trap, especially when it's made really easy for us to solve because we have lube. And yes, there is a genuine section in this book where it feels like Emily mostly is just talking about lube. And so therefore, I'm going to be talking about lube for the next little bit. If you don't have a lot of experience looking into lube, there are a lot of different options. There's a lot of different bases that they come in. They're silicone-based, water-based, yada yada. So, feel free, if you're not that well versed in it, to take your time into looking into what you think works best for you. The one general thing that you might hear a lot about online is that water-based is better, and that's because silicone-based lubes can deteriorate condoms and dental dams, anything kind of like that, and therefore can increase the risk of STIs and pregnancy. So keep that in mind if that's something that pertains to you, but otherwise, feel free to just look into what you think works best for you. While as women, it might be really easy for us to remember, now that we know it, that it is okay that we are turned on and not experiencing a matching genital response, it's also important to remember that the opposite is also true. And I say that because the former tends to be what I think a lot more people tend to experience, or at least women tend to experience. But again, it's just as possible that your genitals can have a response to something while not actually being aroused. And you might be thinking to yourself, because I was thinking this to myself, I feel like I did know that you could have a genital response without actually being aroused. Why did I know that? And if you're a reader, it's probably because there's a really famous, popular book character that happens to. Rhysand from ACOTAR. If you're uncomfortable with discussing sexual assault, you can skip ahead and I'll leave a little timestamp here for when you're in the clear. But something that we find out about Rhysand in the second book in ACOTAR is that Amarantha was sexually assaulting and raping him. I believe in the flashbacks and the retellings where he is talking about this, he even says to himself during one of these experiences, it's just your body responding, it's not real. Because at that moment, he was experiencing non-concordance. He had no interest in sex with Amarantha, but because his genitals understood that this was a sex situation, it responded accordingly with that. And this is extra important to bring up because there is very much a narrative that some people believe in that a person might have been asking for it because they were hard or they were wet, so therefore they must have been okay with it because why else would that happen? And this is why that is not true. So I'm gonna scream it. I'm not actually gonna scream it. I'm gonna say it again and again. Genital response does not equal sexual arousal or pleasure. And I know that this can feel a little bit like conflicting information because I feel like as women already we're given a little bit of this mindset that we have a harder time trusting ourselves compared to other people's opinions and experiences. So you might be a little bit more likely to think, well, if my body is indicating that I'm turned on, I must be turned on. But that is not the case. Trust yourself. Trust your mind. If you aren't aroused, you're not aroused, no matter what your body is saying. If you feel like you are someone that regularly experiences non-concordance, there are 3 things that I want you to remember. 1, you are healthy and normal, as we've said many, many times throughout this series, and that is going to continue to be the case. Your body is not broken just because of non-concordance. A lot of people experience this and it's completely normal. And feel free to let your partner know that this is the case. Not only for your relationship, but also just to spread the word because it's important information to know. Second, try to bridge this gap by figuring out a different way to communicate with your partner that you're turned on. Obviously, the simplest option for this is using your words, but if you have other ideas, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And third, and finally, because I know Emily would want me to say it, lube, 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 lube. In the book, Emily offers some strategies on how to breach this topic because this is sometimes a more uncomfortable discussion to have with your partner, because I can understand how there might be some feelings of inadequacy that can come up, or like a little bit of confusion about if you are actually satisfying your partner, kind of things along those lines. So if you need some help with that, again, check out her book to get a little more into that. Now that we've talked about genital response not necessarily lining up with pleasure, let's dive a little bit deeper into when we actually want sex. Societal norms have likely led you to believe that desire is spontaneous. You're just living your life, walking down the street, and then suddenly, bam, you're turned on. You want a bone. But that's not the only way to experience desire. There are some people who only are interested in sex after sexy things are happening. Like, it might take you already getting into bed with someone that you probably love and trust. And then now that you guys are actually touching, because in this economy, who has bigger than a queen size bed? And so of course you're gonna touch. Suddenly you were like, put me in, coach. And this is considered responsive desire. And both are totally normal. Technically, spontaneous desire is still responsive desire. It's just that because, again, you kind of have a higher accelerator, your body is constantly taking in stimuli, it's just a lot easier for it to trigger, and so it might take very little and feel spontaneous as a result of that, compared to people who either have lower sensitivity accelerators or maybe more brakes, yada yada. You remember what we learned in episode 2, right? Now, I can see how this section kind of feels a little bit confusing, especially after what we talked about with genital response not equaling arousal. So I'm going to make it a little bit more clear. I'm not suggesting that you try to have sex when you don't want it in the hopes that your mind will just catch up with you. This completely contradicts what we just talked about with non-concordance. Arousal does not always lead to desire, but pleasure does, and that's the distinction. Let's take again for the example I gave where you're getting into bed with your partner. With a different context, say you're exhausted and stressed and just want to go to bed, you can go through all those same exact things where you're getting into bed, you're starting to touch, yada yada yada, and you don't feel anything. You feel absolutely no sexual desire or pleasure. It's the same scenario, but because the contexts are different, there's a difference in pleasure and therefore desire. One myth that we've been told to believe is that it's just normal to experience less desire as we get older, oftentimes citing due to hormone changes. And to be honest, this was something I also believed, but that is actually not true, according to the book. I'm not going to get into it because I don't remember specifics on this one, but I'll just say, in short, studies have found that hormones have nothing to do with people's sexual desire. Then a different myth that started to come out is that the culprit for a lack of desire in relationships was monogamy. Stuff like, we aren't meant to be monogamous, yada, yada, yada. And maybe for some that is true, obviously. Polyamory is a thing. But monogamy itself, and also, for that matter, polyamory, is not inherently good or bad for desire. It just depends on the relationship and what the people in it need to feel desire. In the book, Emily outlines 2 different schools of thought for how to maintain desire in long-term monogamous relationships. There is the Perel method and the Gottman method. And for me, this was the real oh shit moment, because I've actually heard of Gottman before, so I was like, this is some real therapy stuff that's about to happen here. The Perel method essentially suggests that by putting a little bit of distance between you and your partner, you create a sense of mystery and novelty in the relationship. There are some people that characterize the beginning of a relationship as new and exciting, and so this is kind of hearkening back to that by creating a little bit of space the same way that you would have some space towards the beginning of a relationship, and therefore that kind of feeds the sexual desire. But in the Gottman method, it's quite literally the opposite, that you are meant to maintain a close, connected, and trusting friendship with your partner and make sex a priority in your lives. If you're wondering which method is correct, the answer is both. It just depends on what you think works better for you. But in either case, it takes intentional effort to implement these strategies to create more of a sense of desire in your relationship, whether that be creating more space or creating more closeness. Sustaining desire in a relationship can be even more complicated when both people in the relationship experience different levels of desire for sex. For instance, we're going to create a fake relationship where partner A experiences spontaneous desire and partner B experiences responsive desire. Because of this, partner A is almost always doing the initiating when it comes to sex. And naturally, partner B oftentimes is the one saying no to sex. Partner A may begin to feel undesirable and rejected in the relationship, while partner B feels pushed and judged for their decision, which can lead them to resisting sex even more. And as a result, both partners begin questioning themselves and wondering if something's wrong with them because they aren't matching up with their partner. Partner B feels guilty for saying no all the time, and partner A wonders if they want sex too much. And as a result, Emily calls this the chasing dynamic. No one is at fault for how they feel in this situation, and actually Emily writes a really touching section for each partner in this situation, empathizing with their circumstances. I'm not going to read it because this is kind of my plug for read the book, but in essence, no matter which partner you resonate with, nothing is wrong with you. We are all made up of the same parts, just organized differently. And in the case of these two partners, one was organized to probably have less sensitive brakes and a more sensitive accelerator, while the other had the opposite. Emily does recommend, if you are in this predicament in your relationship, to take sex off the table for a little while, long enough for it to feel like there's a barrier to it. You do this so that way there is no pressure or resentment that can be built from the expectation that you should or shouldn't be having sex. It's essentially help building a better context, trying to help replace those negative emotions that started to become associated with sex. Obviously, you need to communicate this with your partner so that way you both can intentionally be creating this healthier dynamic together. But once sex has been removed from the situation for long enough, you can start to slowly increasing intimacy again. It's after this that Emily delivers one of the most incredible mic drop moments I've ever read in a book, which she actually quoted from a study done by someone else, Peggy Kleinplatz. And I'm going to read this to you now. Perhaps much of what is currently diagnosed as sexual desire disorders can be best understood as a healthy response to dismal and disappointing sex. Boom! Basically, if you don't like sex, it's probably because the sex you had sucked. Like, isn't that low-key kind of funny? Like, what a sick burn for the people that you've had sex with that it's like, oh no, honey, it wasn't your fault. It was them. Anyway, our girl Peggy, who dropped this incredible line, did a study where they talked to a lot of different people who said they had incredible sex lives. These were people from all different types of backgrounds, people who experienced different levels of sex, like kinky versus non-kinky, and they came up with 8 major components as to why these people had sex worth wanting. And again, this kind of feels like a part where I'm like, should I be giving these secrets away? Because this feels like the whole reason why most people are reading this book, right? So what I'm going to do is kind of list off what these 8 things are, bullet point style. And if you want some more detail, you can check out part 3, chapter 7, page 240 to read the whole thing. So we have being present, focused, and embodied, connection, alignment, merger, being in sync, deep sexual and erotic intimacy, extraordinary communication, authenticity, being genuine, uninhibited, transparency, transcendence, bliss, peace, transformation, healing, exploration, interpersonal risk-taking, fun, and vulnerability and surrender. This is kind of what Emily meant when she talked about having sex that advances the plot. Sex isn't just about having an orgasm. You literally don't need another person to do that. But by looking into one of these 8 components, you can help advance the plot further in your relationship. Not only to have a stronger relationship, but also to have a more fulfilling sex life. This is sex worth having. Obviously, this is a lot of stuff to consider. Even though it was only 8 bullet points, it was also like 16 words or something. So actually, it was definitely more than 16 words. But don't feel as though you need to absolutely have like all of these things mastered in your relationship to have a better sex life. But just see if you can start with one component and see how you can improve upon it in your relationship. And to be honest, I feel like once you work on one, a lot more of them are going to start to follow. It just is sort of a trickle-down effect that the more you improve, the more the other ones are a lot more easier to implement in your life. And that concludes this episode as the Come As You Are series. Thank you all so much for checking out this episode, and be sure to come back for the last episode, the final episode, where we finish the series. We finally start talking about orgasms. Yes, that's what we're here to do. All right, y'all. Have a sexy summer of love. All of the content that you hear in this podcast is curated, recorded, and edited by me truly, with special thanks to the authors of the book that we cover, Emily Nagoski and Pixabay, for the music that we play. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you like to listen, and for more of our content in between shows, you can find us at the Read Receipts Pod on Instagram and TikTok. We read all of your comments and love all your likes, so please, please, please follow along until our next read. Bye!